number 13. Ask our ushers to pass out the lesson sheet tonight and find your place in Nehemiah. Lord willing, we will finish up our study in the book of Nehemiah next week. There are 5 different reformations that I find here in chapter number 13 that Nehemiah is needing to deal with. We covered 2 last week. We'll cover 2 tonight. And then we'll save the last one for after our annual business meeting next week, okay? And so Nehemiah chapter number 13. And last week we began to look at this chapter and to consider it. We considered the first 2 reformations there. And that was a reformation of purging. There was a mixed multitude there, and Nehemiah deals with that. There was also the purging of Tobiah. This was the guy who had an apartment made for him there in the temple, the place of worship there. And so they got him kicked out, got the offering system back in place, got some men who were faithful to take care of that, and they got everything turned around there. And then we found the reformation of provisions in verses 10 through 14. They kind of called for the offerings and said, hey, there's a need here at the church house or at the place of worship. And the offerings came in and those provisions were made. And that brings us thirdly tonight to a reformation of profanity. Now I'm going to explain what I mean here in just a minute. It goes with the P's. All 5 of these will begin with P's. A reformation of profanity. And in verses 15 through 22, we're going to look in this next section here and find out what Nehemiah does here. In verse number 15, the Bible says, "In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, and also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish, and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and I said unto them, What evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers thus, and did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates, that there should be no burden brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them, and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth they came no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy." We find a reformation of profanity. I take this from, verse number, verse number 17. What evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Letter A, the word profane means to treat holy or sacred things with irreverence. And under letter A there, number 1, profanity as we think of it today is primarily used to describe the irreverent use of God's name. Taking the name of the Lord in vain. And it's amazing to me how prolific this has become in recent days. I remember growing up as a young boy, people that would talk differently around children than they would around other people. Or if they noticed that there was a lady in the room or something like that, they would change their speech. Today, it is absolutely everywhere, and it's repulsive to me. And there's, I could go into a whole message, and maybe I should at some point, on this matter of taking the Lord's name in vain. We've gotten so used to, so desensitized to so many things, but it is the irreverent use primarily of God's name. That's how we think of it today. Number 2, profanity, however, can be applied to holy things and places as well. And we find here, number 3, that in these verses, Nehemiah is dealing with the profaning of the Sabbath day and its sacred rules. There were rules associated with the Sabbath. You remember the passage. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. All right, we're familiar with that verse. And on the Sabbath day, God had set that up for the people of Israel, the Saturday, the last day of the week, to whereby they would do no work, they would carry no burdens. It was a day intended for resting. The illustration comes from the week of creation. God takes 6 days where he's creating things. On the seventh day he rests, not because he was tired, but I think to give man a pattern of working 6 days and resting for one. That's a pattern that we need. We move into the New Testament. We've exchanged the Sabbath for the first day of the week. That is we call that the Lord's Day, the day of rest again, and a day where we take time to rest. And so here they had profaned this. How had they profaned it? We'll get into that in letter B. The Sabbath was being profaned in several different ways. First of all, it was being profaned by work or labor being done on the Sabbath. In verse number 15, he sees these people that are treading the wine presses, so they're making grape juice there on the Sabbath day. They're out in their fields bringing in sheaves, loading down their donkeys there in that way. And so we find all of this work that's being done. People have asked me, Pastor, is it okay to work on Sunday? That's between you and God. If you're going to ask my opinion, I'm going to say don't work on Sunday and watch God bless. There's been a lot of work that I could do on a Sunday. I was just talking to somebody the other day. I don't remember who it was now. I was talking to somebody the other day about coming to church. And I'm like, well, I have so many other things. It kind of cuts into my time. I have so many things I want to do. And I said to them, I understand that. I'm right in the middle of moving. I could use a couple of extra days of things to do. But I have found you put the Lord first, and he takes care of everything else. And I can get more done in 6 days, honoring him than I can in 7. Pastor, that sounds crazy. Prove God and see how you'll find he'll be faithful. What it does require us to do, and this isn't in your notes, it's free tonight. What it requires us to do is to prioritize what's truly important. And we find those things, and we'll get our priorities straightened out. Number 2, the Sabbath was also being profaned by goods being bought. By goods being bought. Verses 15 and 16, we find that they're bringing these things into Jerusalem. They're selling these victuals. In verse number 16, we see that they have fish and manners of wear. All these things are for sale. Letter A under number 2. I cannot say dogmatically whether or not the Jews of Jerusalem were selling goods on the Sabbath. The text is a little bit vague there. I'm not going to make a dogmatic position one way or the other. It could go either way. If these men of Tyre are coming in and they're selling things, I'm almost positive that there could probably be some Jews that were doing the same thing. Nehemiah's address is saying to the people of Israel, the people of God, hey, part of why we've gone into captivity, part of why we have this difficulty is because we've stepped away from God's rules. So they were no doubt buying and purchasing on the Sabbath. It would not surprise me if they're working on the Sabbath and they're buying things on the Sabbath to say that they were selling things on the Sabbath too. That could be logical. But I'm not going to say dogmatically. We know for sure, letter B, that the men of Tyre were selling things. In letter C, we also know that the Jews of Jerusalem were working on the Sabbath and that selling is not a far-fetched possibility. Letter D, then, the problem Nehemiah addresses, however, is the purchasing of goods on the Sabbath. He brings up this issue and he says in verse number 15, I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. And he's saying in verse number 16, the men of Tyre are selling things on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah. In verse number 17, he says, what evil thing is this that ye do and profane the Sabbath? Why are you purchasing these things? It's interesting to me, a couple points here under letter D. Nehemiah does not rebuke the worldly merchants for acting like the world and selling things on the Sabbath day. Now, I will say this. If you put God's principles to work, he will bless. I have worked for some companies that have been open 7 days a week. I've worked for one company at one point in time that had made a decision to say, hey, for this span of time, we're only going to work 6 days a week. You know what we found? We were much more productive, and God's blessing was on the company in those 6 days than it was in 7. And you'll find the same thing. I think a good case in point, and I'm not here promoting any one particular brand, but Restaurant Chick-fil-A has taken a stand to not be open on Sunday. You track their earnings reports, and you'll find that they out-earn so many other fast food restaurants. Pastor, it's just coincidence. Their sandwiches are better. I think part of it is God's blessing that they honor His day. Am I saying everybody who works at Chick-fil-A is a Christian and they're doing it for that biblical principle? No, but somebody has made that decision, and it's kind of funny to me how many Christians try to show up at Chick-fil-A on a Sunday only to find out it's not there. I remember during COVID hearing a very well-known preacher. They had not had their in-person services, and they were at home that day, and they said, hey, I'm hungry, let's just go grab something. That drove all the way across town to the Chick-fil-A. Pulled in the driveway, nobody was there, and realized it was Sunday, and I had to drive all the way back home again. But put the Lord first, and you'll find Him blessing. Nehemiah, the second point there under letter D, where he's addressing this issue of purchasing goods, Nehemiah rebukes God's people for violating or profaning God's Sabbath in supporting these worldly merchants' businesses. In other words, what he's saying is, you can't stop the world from acting like the world. But you also don't have to be part of facilitating or encouraging them to do that. There's a simple principle when it comes to the free market, and that is that if nobody's purchasing the wares or nobody's purchasing the goods, typically the shops close. A couple of years ago, we took a trip down to Alton for a couple of days, and we were down there over a Monday and Tuesday. I think half of Alton was closed on Monday and Tuesday. The thrift store or whatever was closed, and we went to go here, and closed Mondays and Tuesdays. It was really nice. There wasn't a lot of people around, but the businesses reflected that. And so we find this principle here. Second side of your lesson sheet then tonight, letter E. Nehemiah makes some changes, and the merchants test the changes. In verse number 19, it came to pass, the Bible says, that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, Nehemiah makes a commandment in this verse number 19, that the gates should be shut, he says, and charged that they should not be open until after the Sabbath. And so this is the change. Hey, we're going to shut the gates. We're not even going to open up the city to allow these people in. And right away, what happens? We find that in verse number 20, that is tested. Verse number 20, so the merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. In other words, there was a couple of weeks here where they said, oh, he's just got a problem with us or whatever. This will blow by. The people will still come out. And he says, no, the gates are staying shut. And so they're there for a short time, and then they eventually go away. Letter F, we find that Nehemiah threatens the merchants in verse number 21. I testified against them and said unto them, why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I will lay hands on you. Far from him caving in to their trade, he says, listen, enough's enough. We're not having this anymore. If you're out here again, I'll arrest you. I'll lay hands on you. And what's the result? In verse number 21, from that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. Now, let me ask you a question. Is Nehemiah just an angry leader? Why is he doing this? Why is he threatening these merchants? Doesn't he know that there's people that need to buy things? Let me ask you a question. Can God provide for your needs before the Sabbath day, the day of rest, or after the day of rest? Sure he can. For 40 years in the wilderness, he did it every single week. The manna was twice in abundance the day before the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath day, there was nothing. If you tried to take too much, it would spoil. If you didn't take enough, you went hungry. You got a free fast in there. And took some time to pray and get your heart right with God. I guess it was. But here he makes that threat to them, runs them off effectively. He's doing that to help protect the people. Letter G, Nehemiah implements safeguards to keep this new policy in place. In verse number 22, he commands the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, they should come and keep the gates, and sanctify the Sabbath day. He says, listen, we finally have run these guys off. I'm doing this for the benefit of the people. Now let's maintain that. Let's keep that in its place. And then at the end of verse number 22, we find Nehemiah's motive is revealed, and that is that he desired God to notice his faithfulness to promoting purity over profanity. He says in verse number 22, remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. He's returned to Jerusalem. He finds this problem. He says, I see this problem. I'm going to deal with this problem, not just to flex my muscles or not just to show how strong of a leader I am, but to keep the worship of God pure and holy, and he does so. We move on then to verses 23 through 28, and we find, number 4, a reformation of pledging. A reformation of pledging. In verse number 23, the Bible says this, in those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon king of Israel sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God in marrying strange wives? And one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. There's a reformation of pledging. Letter A, Nehemiah gets down to a very personal level in his reformation, and that is the level of marriage. Now, we're working through a series on Sunday nights about that, but here he deals with the issues. He's returned to Jerusalem. And a lot of this reminds me of when Paul is dealing with the letter of 1 Corinthians to the church at Corinth. They had a number of things that were messed up. Nehemiah comes back to Jerusalem, sees there's some things that are messed up, and he's trying to straighten them out. The worship system was messed up, and this was another one. Relationships were messed up. Letter B, how were they messed up? There were marriages taking place between the people of God and the women of Ashdod from Ammon and Moab. And so we find what's happening here is there's this, well, I'll give it to you there in letter C. The result was the mamas were teaching their children their mother tongue, and these children were being raised in these mixed homes without the ability to speak or to understand the Jews' language. And so we find there in verse number 24 that they could not speak in the language of the Jews. Now that's going to create a number of different difficulties. They could get by on a day-to-day level using that other language, but when you came to the worship system and they couldn't speak, they couldn't understand the language of the Jews, they're not going to have a clue what's going on in church, to put it in today's terms, okay? It blows my mind, some of these churches that put a heavy emphasis on speaking in tongues that you can't understand. Paul addresses this very clearly. He says if there's someone who has the gift of tongues at that point in time, and I personally believe that gift as a sign gift was done away with in the past. Now that we have the full canon of Scripture, I don't think we need that gift anymore. But here he says if someone's going to speak, they need to make sure that there's an interpreter who can interpret what was said, and if they can't interpret it, then the person needs to sit down. You don't hear that being promoted very much in some of these places. The issue they had here was they couldn't speak or understand the Jews' language, and letter D, Nehemiah vehemently contends with them and causes them to promise to break off this passage. In verse number 25, this is the level he goes to. He says, I contended with them and cursed them and smote certain of them. No, I haven't done this in church yet. Not really planning on starting anytime soon. I've contended with people, I will say that, over doctrine and things of that nature. I've never, to my knowledge, cursed anybody here. I haven't hit anybody that I can remember. And certainly, I know for sure, I haven't plucked off your hair. There was a time. in church where I got one of Emily's. But that was a different story, all right? We'll save that for another day. But he's contending with them, vehemently so. Verse number 25 goes on. He says, I made them swear by God, saying, ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. As Christians, we've gotten very lax in this area. This matter, the Bible makes it very clear, don't be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. You're going to have a rough life ahead of you. Oh, but Pastor, she's the prettiest thing I've ever seen. When I see her, the butterflies just explode everywhere. You know, my number one question, is she saved? That's what matters most. Oh, but have you seen his muscles? Don't need to. Let's start with this. Is he saved? A Christian has no business chasing after a lost person. You're just headed down a road of heartache, and there will be more to come on that in a Sunday night near you, all right? And we'll save that one for another day. Letter E, Nehemiah presents an argument from Israel's history. That argument is the illustration of Solomon. That's your blank, the word Solomon, whose strange wives, and the Bible uses the word caused him to sin. In verse 26, it says this, did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him. And I would agree with that. Solomon, the wisest king, he had all kinds of financial investments and wealth and wisdom and all of these things that he had, yet he fails miserably. Verse number 26, he was beloved of his God. God made him king over all Israel. He served under the united kingdom there of Israel and Judah together. And verse number 26 says this, nevertheless, even him, and I would put in parentheses there, with all of his wisdom, did outlandish women cause to sin. Pastor, what are outlandish women? We'll get to that later on Sunday night. What's the point? Solomon had great wisdom, but he was hooked up with the wrong women. Solomon is not, if there is an illustration in the Bible of how not to be a husband, it is Solomon. If there's an example of a husband that I do not want my son to follow, it is Solomon. Pastor, but Solomon was the wisest man. He may have been wise, but he was foolish in how many wives and what wives he took to himself. He heaped to himself wives that had followed after false gods, and in his old age they turned his heart away from God. He's building temples and places for idolatry, and we find the Nehemiah is even using that as an illustration. Letter F, Nehemiah makes the case that he cannot approve of this transgression. In verse number 27, shall we then hearken unto you and do all this great evil to transgress against our God and marrying strange wives? He draws a line in the sand and he says, this is just not right. We can't agree with this. And then he takes it one step further in verse number 28, and he separates from one of the sons of the priestly line that had married Sanballat's daughter. In verse number 28, there's this son of Joiadim, the son of Eliashib, the high priest. He's in that priestly line. He is son-in-law to Sanballat. He's married one of Sanballat's daughters, and Nehemiah makes the choice in verse number 28. He says, therefore I chased him from me. You have this priestly position. You're unequally yoked with this woman who's a child or a follower of a false god. It's an unequal yoke, and he separates from them, and he, in so doing, has this reformation in regards to the pledging of husbands and wives. And we'll get back to this topic next week, and we'll finish up our fifth one after our business meeting. All right, let's go to Lord.